from chapter 7 of the first letter to the Corinthians, reading simply verses 29 and to 31. Listen with me for a word from God. I mean, brothers and sisters, the appointed time has grown short. From now on, let even those who have wives be as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no possessions, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, I bring you this word today. Amen. The world is being radically changed. And this is how Paul excuses his urgency. Because whatever else Paul is, he is most certainly urgent in all of his own letters. Especially the letters to the church in Corinth, which are full of warning signs and what Paul clearly considers essential advice. This letter in particular mentions the concerns of the people in Corinth, concerns around the morality of believers. And this gives Paul a chance to hold forth on one of his favorite subjects, marriage and self-control. Essentially, what it means to be a faithful person in a time where there seems to be a sexual revolution going on. Early in the 7th chapter of the first letter, the question is stated. It is well for a man not to touch a woman. This is only one of the things that the people in Corinth have been concerned about and asking Paul for guidance about. And of course, Paul being Paul weighs in and says, well, it's better to be married than descend into sexual immorality. Seems pretty simple, but Paul's heart is not in it. I say this by way of concession, not command, says Paul. I wish that all were as I myself am, single, but each has a particular gift from God. He is concerned, Paul, about relationships, about faithfulness in relationships, about how the new faith expresses itself in relationship. Because yes, the world is being radically changed. And Paul wants his friends to be ready. Not just because of changes in society, though that would be challenge enough. You see, Paul has discovered since his encounter with the risen Christ that there are fundamental changes promised by God. And the appointed time has grown short. I don't preach much out of Paul's letters because there's all kinds of incongruities in them. And these warnings about the end of time don't always catch our 21st century imaginations in the right way. End time predictions are the tabloid trash of Christianity. Because too many preachers have exploited human anxiety by twisting these texts to describe their situation. And so I have no confidence in that kind of apocalyptic certainty. And unfortunately, Paul offers much of the fuel needed for the fire and brimstone crowd, what with his references to time growing short and the passing form of the world. Stay single or stay married. Don't get too deeply invested in the stuff of this world, says Paul. And the end of time crowd slides to the edge of their seats in breathless anticipation. And I'm just not buying it. I'm sorry. But I am convinced that Paul was reading the signs of change correctly. Not because the apocalypse was imminent, clearly it wasn't, but because his world has recently been completely undone. Paul is a man on a journey from studious, faithful, zealous believer in the ancient traditions of Judaism to becoming a follower of Jesus and a proclaimer of the gospel. And we get to see Paul at various stages in this journey. He is, to his credit, not ashamed of the foundations of his faith. You remember that memorable bit in Philippians. I am a Hebrew born of Hebrews, circumcised on the 8th day, as to the law a zealot. He knows who he is. And so long as that early form of Paul's faith remains unshaken, all is right in his world. Because within the precepts and promises of his well-researched faith, Paul has found a way to navigate the chaos that was the ancient Near East. So sure is Paul that his faith is essential to his and society's survival and well-being, that he pursues and persecutes those who seem to pervert his notion of pure Judaism. Paul was, is, and ever shall be a true believer. And into Paul's certainty, there arrives a challenger. Jews who proclaim Messiah has come. Those who follow a leader who was raised from death. And initially, for Paul, this new revelation offered nothing but confusion. Paul's faith had taught him, and his experience had shown him that life was hard and death was final, and that was that. The suggestion of anything else is disruptive, pie-in-the-sky nonsense until Paul's own certainties were challenged by an encounter with Jesus. Suddenly, a world that had made perfect sense to Paul through the lens of his faith had to be imagined differently. The resurrection of Jesus is the sign that a world once defined by lives that lead to death is now a world described in God's terms, just as it was in the beginning. Human life had been for too long defined by earthly structures and human powers. But now the human powers have been rendered powerless. The grave cannot hold the one whom the worldly powers thought they had defeated. And Paul is learning this and trying to come to grips with it all. Jesus' talk of the weak made strong and the meek inheriting the earth takes on real meaning once we are confronted by the resurrection, by the risen Jesus. The world as it once was, limiting and limited, described only by human imagination. After the resurrection, that world is once again the property and product of God's holy imagination. And Paul's eyes are gradually opened to a different but no less faithful way of understanding God's desire for creation. The form of this world is passing away. And it is tempting to fall into the trap set by the end times crowd. I know it's tempting because I stood on the edge of that trap once myself. Now, just as in Paul's time, the slow but steady increase in divisive politics and competitive religious fervor has produced, time and time again, disastrous human consequences. Humanity seems bent on falling further down from the divine ideal every single day. But what if Paul is not calling for people to wait patiently for the apocalypse? What if that radical upheaval has already happened? Paul's encounter with Jesus, that conversion from one kind of faithfulness to a new understanding of faithfulness, sets for Paul the world on a fresh foundation. In Jesus, Paul finds a new way to understand the world. Evil acts are not altogether eliminated. He can see that. But they are revealed as fruitless failures of human endeavor. And rather than a climactic battle between good and evil, Paul is able to see in everything the small, subversive spark of hope. The present form of this world is passing away. The assumptions that Paul formerly held are being eroded, and the goodness of God for Paul is prevailing, little by little. And it seems to me now, in my current state and age and form, it seems to me that this is exactly how God works. Notwithstanding our favorite stories of the massive displays of divine intervention, the floods, the plagues, and all that Cecil B. DeMille stuff, even within those stories of such massive scale, the revelation of God happens slowly and sometimes quietly. It happens piecemeal. Even on the day of resurrection, that great act of divine love and justice is understood only gradually, little by little, person by person. And it is much later that it is fully acknowledged as an act of God. Time is growing short. The form of this world is still passing away. And in every terrible, challenging moment, there is the opportunity to see both the worst of things and the best of things. And because we are people of the resurrection, we have been given the chance to set our perception of the world to rights. We can, in faith, find the spark of hope in the darkest moments of human history. We find the strength and courage to persevere, to move forward, not longing for the end, but sure that God is doing a new thing. That is the treasure of the gospel. Not that God would allow evil to bring things to an end, but that God, in spite of evil, continues to redeem and recreate in front of our eyes. Let that even now be so. Amen.